Hi guys, and welcome to a historic event. Now, I've been lucky enough to get access to this incredible meeting. I am here with 10 of the most powerful Western European countries, and we're lucky enough that the USA and Canada have also decided to join us. We're here in 1949, and they are signing, as you can see behind me, the very first document of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They have already decided upon their quotation, their main message: an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or America shall be considered an attack against them all. So basically what this is saying is that if one of them is attacked, if one of these lovely gentlemen behind me feels a threat, every single one of the others will come to their aid. Now, we've spoken about this before. It means we finally have a military alliance. They are together, they are one. If they are threatened by the Soviets, by communism, they are going to come together and they will defend each other. Now, this treaty is really important because it shows something from America in particular. We've discussed America used to follow a policy of isolationism. Now, that means the idea of keeping to themselves, not involving themselves in European affairs. This started pretty much at the end of World War I. After getting involved in that war, they thought, you know what, we need to distance ourselves from Europe, from all that's going on there, and we need to focus on ourselves. And they followed this policy, and it was great. And we had the boom in America in the 1920s, and that was all fantastic for America. Lots of success. Obviously, they entered the Second World War because of Pearl Harbor, because they are attacked. But then we're all kind of left in wait. What are they going to do afterwards? Are they going to continue to be involved and to care about Europe, or are they going to go back and follow that policy of isolationism? So this treaty really kind of proved to the world that America are genuinely committed to the Truman Doctrine and to containing communism, because it shows them getting themselves involved in those European affairs. This treaty comes very slightly after an initial treaty, shall I say, the Treaty of Brussels. Now, this was signed between Britain, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg in 1948, so 1 year earlier, and showed that combination of European states coming together to say they're going to protect themselves and to try and stop the spread of communism. Now, it was the trigger event of the Berlin blockade, again, something we've talked about earlier in an earlier video, the Berlin blockade that brought in other countries. They saw this happening, they were genuinely fearful, and they said, do you know what, we need to be a part of this. And it was at that moment where Britain and the other countries thought, we should be opening this up to America. They are going to be so important to our security. So 1949, after the Berlin blockade, NATO is formed, a military alliance to protect these countries against the Soviet Union. One of the most important things that you should know is that the USA provided funds to these European militaries to help them boost themselves, okay? So not only do we have the Marshall Plan, but on top of that, we're now giving money to these European armies to help them get stronger. So America are essentially helping themselves by helping their allies. And, you know, it's quite logical, isn't it? You're America, you're over here in the world. Europe is over here. Stalin and the USSR is over here. So they're going to go through them first. That's where the action is happening at the moment in Europe. So if we put money into boosting those allies that we have in Europe, we're going to really help ourselves in the long run. They also decide and are allowed to build military bases and put American troops into these European countries. So places in Europe start to develop, start to build US military bases, and you know, they put US troops on the ground there. So that's the NATO agreement in 1949, okay? And you've had a personal insight view of what happened. Okay, after this big event, 1949, the formation of NATO, a very sad and tragic and traumatic event happens to the Soviet Union. I am here, I am present, I'm reporting live. Stalin has sadly passed away. In 1953, at his countryside dacha, so kind of his countryside house, Stalin dies aged 74 of a stroke. He's found by his cleaning lady, and for a long time, lots of his closest aides, his closest allies, don't really believe this has happened. It's all a bit risky in Russia to kind of, come out and declare things like this. You could be, accused of treachery. So it's all a bit tense, okay? But it is discovered, it is released that Stalin dies. His body is buried with Lenin in the same tomb, and he is regarded as a state hero. He's given, a lavish funeral to commemorate his death and his passing. Now, this obviously leaves what we might call a power vacuum. A power vacuum is a really useful word to know in history, and it's where we have a gap, a space. So if somebody who's leading a country dies or is, usurped or goes away for whatever reason, we suddenly have a gap. And often that gap is filled very clearly, very logically. For example, if the queen is to die, the gap is filled by her son, her daughter, whoever comes next in the line of succession. If the prime minister was to sadly pass away, or, for whatever reason, his term came to an end, we have a process where we fill that gap. We have another election, or the party chooses within themselves, but we know all those steps. Now, in countries where you don't have quite so clearly delineated steps or democratic processes, sometimes we're left with a situation where we don't really know who's going to come next. And the Soviet Union is one of those cases. Now, what actually happens is a man called Nikita Khrushchev comes to fill that role. And in the first instance, he isn't quite secure in his job. So he has to be really strong. And he has to come across incredibly strong about what he's doing to try and kind of fill the shoes of Stalin. So that's Khrushchev, and he's the man who comes next in our process. Okay, so the year is 1955. We're here. Khrushchev is right behind me. He's talking. Huge audiences come to listen. Very, very exciting. Now, 1955 is a very important year for the Soviet Union. In response to NATO, they've been a bit on edge, but nothing has changed significantly for the Soviet Union until this point. Now, in 1955, West Germany is allowed to join NATO. Now, that means they're being fully respected as an independent country. It means that clearly the policy of the USA and of Great Britain is towards regeneration, regenerating Germany rather than keeping it suffering. But most importantly, it means that the army is going to be rebuilt. Germany is finally allowed to have a strong defense system again. I guess they've finally been forgiven, they've finally been trusted, and we're going to build up the army in just the same way that we've built up the army in other European nations. So America is going to be putting money into this, and we're going to see a thriving of the West German army and defense system. Now, if you remember back to when we talked about the peace conferences, so Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, you'll remember that one of the Soviet Union's prime priorities, most key concerns in Europe, in the rebuilding of Europe after war, was that we keep Germany weak. Germany, as we know, completely betrayed them. Operation Barbarossa, they invaded the Soviet Union, and they got very far, and they did a huge amount of damage. So for the Soviet Union, keeping Germany weak was one of their main concerns. With West Germany joining NATO, that clearly has been completely disregarded by Britain and America. So at this point, Khrushchev, our new leader, who's taken over from Stalin a couple of years earlier in 1953, so we're now in 1955, Khrushchev, this gentleman here, took over in 1953, 2 years later. He has to act strong, okay? I told you just a moment ago, he's come into Stalin's shoes. Stalin was a huge character, had a huge following, had what we call a cult of personality. Everybody followed Stalin. Everybody was a bit scared of Stalin. He absolutely had the utmost authority in the Soviet Union. And he doesn't want to look weak, Khrushchev, okay? So he has to be strong here. By being strong, what he does is he forms an alternative organization to NATO, and he calls it the Warsaw Pact. He presents it as a collective security treaty organization in just the same way that NATO is. However, under the surface of that, it's quite clear that really what it is it's a way of officially having control over Eastern Europe, and most importantly, having control over their militaries. Okay, so after the Warsaw Pact is formed, Khrushchev has control of 5.5 million men, as in soldiers. Okay, now that's a huge army. He also has 35,000 tanks and 10,000 fighter planes. So Khrushchev is really considerably officiating, making it official that he is now in control of Eastern Europe, and he can use those militaries at his whim, essentially. What might also be important to know is that he has nuclear weapons by this point. We haven't looked at the arms race yet, that will come soon, but he has got nuclear weapons. Equally, Britain, USA and France also have nuclear weapons. So we have got a situation where both sides are now united into two different power bodies, and it's very similar to that same situation we saw, you probably know about, when we look at the causes of World War I. Once those alliances are formed, the potential for that to spark and war to happen is massively heightened. Okay, so it's really much more likely now that we're going to see a war. So when you get asked questions about why does this raise tensions, things like that, it's because we have two military alliances who are much more likely to go to actual full frontal war now, because if any one of these countries is drawn in, then everyone else should come to their aid. We're also seeing the rebuilding of the militaries, the rebuilding of the armies, and all of that combined has massively raised the stakes in this Cold War. The tension has considerably grown, and there really is that chance for spark. Okay, now there's one other really important thing that happens at this time, and that is a thing called De-Stalinisation. So 1955, Khrushchev comes in, Warsaw Pact, strong, sticking to Stalin's line of policy. Okay, 1 year later, 1956, this man here does something hugely surprising. He goes into the 20th Party Congress. Now, this was a meeting of kind of all the delegates, all the important people in the Soviet Union. I guess, you know, a little bit like Parliament, something like that, where you sit down, you discuss things. And he goes in and he makes a speech. Now, this speech was called the secret speech. It was supposed to be secret. However, I think he and everybody else knew that really his ultimate goal here was for this to spread. And he really wants people to hear this. His secret speech criticized Stalin. He criticized Stalin's brutality. He criticized Stalin's use of the gulags, terror system, and effectively talked about how he wanted to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union. He wanted to enter a period of peaceful coexistence, is the phrase he uses. Peaceful coexistence, okay? New, more open approach to the world, trying to not let the Soviet Union be so cut off from the rest of the world as it had been previously. So this is massive. This goes against everything Stalin's kind of laid down, you know, independent power of the Soviet Union against everybody who wishes to stand in their way. So de-Stalinisation was effectively Khrushchev going in and talking about how we want to have a new, more open approach, peaceful coexistence, and open us up to the world, make it more likely for us to have relationships and, you know, political diplomacy with other countries, including capitalist countries such as America and things like that. Just a tiny bit of detail, if you were curious about what he actually does with this de-Stalinisation, is he targets some of the things that were really integral to Stalinist rule. One of those is the cult personality. Now, I mentioned that briefly before, not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but basically it's the idea of this kind of fanatic following almost about Stalin. He took Stalin's name out of buildings and places. He renamed Stalingrad to Volgograd. I think I'm pronouncing that right. So he renamed Stalingrad, takes Stalin's name out of that, very important city, changes building names. He purges the state anthem of all references to Stalin. So it's just this idea of trying to break down that celebrity figure a bit, trying to make him less idealized or idolized, even. I could use that word, that would be better. He also decides to kind of close down and a lot of the gulags and free a lot of the political prisoners. So on Stalin's death, huge numbers of political prisoners who've been put into these gulags and these prison systems in Siberia in the east are freed. Lots and lots of people who were captured in the liberation of Europe. As the Soviet Union went in, they were quite well known for arresting people who they saw to have been collaborating with the Germans. Now that might just be things like, I sold the Germans a loaf of bread in some cases. But a lot of these political prisoners are freed from the gulags and they're allowed to go home finally after, 9, 10, whatever, however many years it's been. So he starts to shut down the gulag system. He sees that as an embarrassment to the Western world. And finally, he kind of goes back on a lot of the Stalinist political policies, kind of rapid industrialization and things like that. So lots of key dates today. 1949, NATO, we were at the meeting, you were there, you can't forget it. 1953, Stalin has died. And 1955, the Warsaw Pact is formed. 1956, Khrushchev makes his secret De-Stalinisation speech, and we start to see the Soviet Union potentially take a different path. So I guess the question you're wondering is, what does this change? What's happened to those tension levels that we always talk about? Is the tension high? Is it low? What's going on? So NATO, I think we can be safe to say, definitely rises it, an allied military front. Stalin's death, well, there's a power vacuum there. We don't really know what's going to happen. Potentially it could get worse, potentially better. With the formation of NATO, the Warsaw Pact, I think that's clearly showing it gets worse. De-Stalinisation, however, brings that tension down. It's showing a move from the Soviet Union that they don't want to be quite so aggressive and at odds with the rest of Europe. So it's really surprising. That's why I said earlier, it's really surprising. It goes against, everything we kind of expected. But just to recap those key dates for you at the end of this video. So 49 was the formation of NATO, 12 West European countries along with the USA and Canada joined to make a military alliance. If one of us is hurt, we will all defend them. 1953, the death of Stalin, replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. 1955, the Warsaw Pact comes after the trigger event of West Germany joining NATO, Khrushchev having to look strong. And finally, 1956 was the De-Stalinisation speech, where Khrushchev talks about the cruelty and the brutality of Stalin and shows a move away from that and a move into what we call peaceful coexistence. Now, we need to stay tuned and see if that actually happens or not. Hope you're on the edge of your seats, guys, to see what happens next.